into our next briefing, which is for Professor Palmer's group on America's Revegetation and Carbon Sequestration Act of 2023.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Excited to share with you our final briefing summarizing our work over the semester on America's Revegetation and Carbon Sequestration Act of 2023, or the ARCS Act. I want to give a big thank you to my teammates, John and Tiani, for their support with the content of this briefing, our teammate Amanda for her tireless work on the design, our whole team for their work throughout the semester that really set the foundation for this briefing, and of course, Dr. Palmer for his advisement throughout the summer and the fall. Now, before we dive into the act itself, let's take a moment to remind ourselves, what problem are we trying to solve? I don't think I need to tell the folks in this room that carbon emissions are really causing a climate crisis, but forests play a really valuable role in helping mitigate that crisis. They pull carbon out of the air, a process known as sequestration, and in 2021, they sequestered nearly a gigaton of carbon from the atmosphere. So that's about 13% of US gross emissions for that year. But from 1990 to 2021, there was a 14% reduction in their annual ability to actually sequester that carbon from the atmosphere. They're facing a number of threats from wildfires, droughts, invasive species, all of which are related to and exacerbated by climate change. So these reduce the amount of forests that we have to pull carbon from the atmosphere and can make the forests that remain less productive. So we need to take action or this problem is going to get worse. And so for an example of what we can do in terms of restoration, we're going to jump down to southwest Colorado to the Uncompahgre Plateau. So this is a series of 3 national forests, the Uncompahgre, the San Juan, and the Grand Mesas, that in 2010 were selected for a federal grant for what's known as a collaborative landscape restoration project. And so this area was selected in part because it has high fire risk and there's valuable infrastructure that runs through this area. And they had active native seed and invasive species programs, meaning they could start to implement this restoration project quickly. Now, in terms of management techniques, they're going to look at native seed planting, invasive species management, and using prescribed burning and thinning to reduce fuel load. And so what they should do is reestablish native vegetation and reduce fire risk and suppression costs, which should enhance the resilience of the area and help sequester more carbon over the long run. And so that's really what the main goal for the ARCS Act is to increase the carbon sequestration potential for forests in the western portion of the United States. So what we mean by that is of the 9 regions of the Forest Service, there are 6 that are to the west of the 100th meridian, and those are going to be the focus of this bill. Now, it's a wide sweeping bill. It's got 4 titles, and for the sake of today and for time constraints, we're really just going to focus in on Title 1 on revegetation and reforestation, and specifically on one section of that title, the National Revegetation Strategy. All right, so this is a quick overview of what that looks like. We're going to have 3 planning goals leading up to our ultimate revegetation strategy goal of revegetating 25% of targeted areas. All right, so our program design is going to cover these 3 planning goals, starting with developing and using a regional assessment tool to figure out which areas within these regions should be prioritized for restoration. We're going to form our interagency task force. So these are the folks that are actually going to drive the work forward. And then finally, we're going to apply that and figure out, okay, well, now we know where we want to revegetate. What does that plan to actually do the revegetation look like? So what we're going to do is go through our program design for each of these 3 planning goals, looking at who's doing the work, what do we have to do, how are we going to measure success. So starting with the first planning goal, the regional assessment tool. The bill gives us 3 mandates. We're on the top here. So within 6 months after enactment, we need to actually have created the tool. After a year, we need to have applied it across all of the regions. And by 18 months, we have to have created a report that actually puts together all of that analysis. What did we find from applying this tool across all these regions? Now, in terms of KPIs, our first and our third mandate here are pretty binary. Did you do the work or not? But our middle one here, the actual assessment, we want to look at what's the quality of the data we use. Did we use all of the right data? Was our methodology approved by experts? We're going to have to make trade-offs. Which things do we care about more? Vegetation departure or wildfire risk? And finally, what's the quality of our interface? So is it accessible? Is it easy to actually look at the data and understand what this report says? Now, who's doing the work? Everything is going to roll up to the Deputy Chief of the National Forest Service. And underneath that, we have a set of contractors. So in our program design, we decided to go with a contract for two main reasons. First and foremost, this work needs to get done quickly, and it wouldn't be feasible to think about going through a federal hiring process. And second, this work is time-bound. So after the 18 months, this role goes away. And so a contract makes a lot of sense. Now we're going to have a national lead on this contract that's going to report directly with the deputy chief. And underneath them, we're going to have one person per region, so 6 regional coordinators in total, and a set of data analysts underneath them that are actually going through and using GIS and doing analytics to understand what this revegetation assessment looks like. In total, we expect this to cost about $24 million over 18 months, and it'll require 37 of these contractors. Now from there, planning goal number 2 is to establish our interagency task force. So this is the group that's going to actually coordinate with a bunch of the federal and non-federal entities and is ultimately going to drive the revegetation efforts forward. So the bill just mandates that by 18 months we've actually established this task force. There's a lot of discretion here. And so what we've decided is that by 1 year we want to have hired all of our senior staff and half of our junior staff. And on an ongoing basis, since this is an interagency task force, we want to make sure that we're actually having regular meetings with all of these other agencies we should be liaising with. So think about Fish and Wildlife Management or the Bureau of Land Reclamation, state and local governments. Those would all be folks that we should be engaging with. Now, what the team actually looks like is, again, we have the Deputy Chief of the National Forest Service at the top here. Underneath them, we have our regional foresters. So I mentioned before that there's 9 regions in the Forest Service, forest system. 6 of them are going to be relevant to our bill. Those are the 6 in the western portion. Every single section of the forest has a regional forester that's in charge of it. And so these regional foresters will head up these task force. And our new hires on the right are going to include a task force coordinator. So think of like the project manager driving everything forward, and they're going to take the lead on writing these revegetation reports. We have our relations specialists that will actually liaise with all of those different agencies I just mentioned. And then our data analysts who will use GIS to get into the nitty-gritty of what's the actual revegetation plan look like. In total, we expect about $11 million of spending over these 2 years for this personnel, and it'll require 36 new hires. Now, once we have this task force, again, they're the ones that will drive this third planning goal, which is developing the revegetation plans. The bill just mandates that we have a comprehensive strategy and implementation plan for each of the regions by the end of 2 years. So in our program design, what we decided to do was have accelerated pilots starting at 1 year, one within each of the regions, to begin to get some early learning, develop the channels of communication, get some feedback going. And by 18 months, we'll have a first draft of these plans. It'll be rough, but that gives us 6 months to get feedback and incorporate that by the end of 2 years into each of these finalized plans. All right, so we just went through these 3 planning goals. We're going to create our tool, we're going to form our team, and we're going to apply the tool to figure out where are we developing these revegetation plans. And over this 2 years, it's about $35 million of spending and 75 personnel split between contractors and new staff that's hired by the Forest Service. All of this is driving towards this long-term 10-year goal of revegetating 25% of targeted areas. And so even though this $35 million number is fairly low, over that 10-year period, the legislators expect that this bill would cost $60 to $70 billion. So this is a very large bill. That information comes from a conversation our teammates Rebecca and Brenda had early in the semester with one of the aides working on the bill. And so just to put that in perspective, that's somewhere in the order of a third of an increase to the Forest Service budget on an annualized basis. So again, a large bill, and we are just looking at the planning portion of one section of one title of this very large bill. So going forward, there's a lot of spending that would go boots on the ground and machinery and seeds that need to get planted, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so at the end of 10 years, we spent all this money. What do we actually expect to get? So let's come back to our case study and think about 10 years later in the Uncompahgre Plateau, what results were they able to generate? So they were able to reduce tree canopy and increase meadow coverage, which are things that reduce fire risk and increase resilience. And that is projected to lower firefighting costs by 20 to 50%. So how'd they do that? If you compare this pre-burn and this post-burn picture over here, you can see that prior to the burn, there was a lot more like shrubs and small grass that are fuel for fires and can help fires spread. Right? So by removing those in prescribed burns, you reduce the fire risk. And this really demonstrated successful restoration through collaboration. That's a model that mirrors what we're going to do with our interagency task force. All right, so with this idea of what success can look like in mind, here's where I'll leave you. We know that climate change is a serious threat that's facing U.S. forests. The ARCS Act would revegetate 25% of targeted lands in 10 years. Now, we can look to prior restoration efforts to understand what that could look like and how we can scale it up. And what our program design does is really enable the planning process for revegetation and assessment. So with that, thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you for the amazing presentation. So you mentioned that there is an interagency task force, and I was quite curious about that. Is there any consideration of including, let's say, like non-federal entities like schools and universities or like nonprofits in this research and in this task force?
So the task force itself wouldn't include groups like that, but a large portion of what their job is to do is to interact with those types of more local groups. So, I hit on at the end sort of like this idea that in the case study we saw the value of collaboration. And when you go and you actually read their reports, they talk time and time again about how the fact that they actually had like conversations with those types of local groups created buy-in and actually allowed them to move much more quickly. In a lot of cases, if you don't have that buy-in, what you'll get is like local opposition and legal challenges, and all that stuff slows the process down. And so there is a lot of value in exactly what you're talking about. Those folks would just be outside the task force, and they're the folks that we engage with.
I see. Thank you so much.